You're lying in bed. The room is completely dark. Your phone's charging across the room, so there's no glow from the screen, no streetlight bleeding through the curtains, just total, absolute darkness. Then you hear it. A sound. Maybe it's a creak from the hallway, maybe it's something shifting in the closet, maybe it's nothing at all. But in that instant, before your rational brain can even process what you heard, your heart rate spikes, your muscles tense, your breathing stops for just a second. You're listening now, really listening. And in that darkness, your mind starts filling in possibilities, not pleasant ones. This happens to almost everyone, even when you know intellectually that you're safe, even when you know there's nothing in your house that wants to eat you, even when you know the sound was probably just the building settling or the cat knocking something over. The fear comes anyway, immediate, involuntary, primal. Here's the question that should keep you up at night. Except we're trying to help you sleep, so maybe don't think about it too hard. Why? Why do we still feel this? You've got deadbolts on your doors, windows that lock. You live in a world where the most dangerous thing in your bedroom is probably tripping over your shoes in the dark. There are no predators stalking you, no lions waiting in the shadows, no wolves circling your house. The rational part of your brain knows this, but the ancient part, the part that's been with you for millions of years, that part isn't listening to reason. That part knows something you've forgotten. There was something in the dark. For most of human evolutionary history, for millions of years before we became human, darkness wasn't just uncomfortable or inconvenient. It was the hunting hour. It was when things with better night vision than us, things with sharper teeth and stronger jaws, came out to feed. And we were on the menu. Your fear of the dark isn't irrational. It's a memory, not your memory, not something from your childhood, but something deeper. A species memory, written into your DNA by countless ancestors who heard sounds in the darkness and didn't react fast enough. This is the story of that fear, where it came from, what was really out there, and why, even now in our world of electric lights and climate control and grocery stores, we still can't shake the feeling that something might be watching from the shadows. We're going to travel back millions of years, through paleontology and evolutionary biology, through archaeological evidence and neuroscience, to understand the predator that shaped us. And if you want to dive even deeper into these prehistoric secrets, we've got stories and facts you won't find anywhere else in our book at sleepytimehistory.com. But first, we need to go back, way back, before humans were the hunters, when we were something else entirely. 6 million years ago, give or take a few 100,000 years, your ancestors weren't human. They weren't even close. They were small, upright walking primates stumbling around the African savanna, trying desperately not to get eaten. Picture this. You're about 4 feet tall, maybe 60 pounds if you've been eating well. You've got no claws, no fangs, no venom, no armor. Your night vision is terrible compared to most mammals. You can't run particularly fast. You can't climb as well as your tree-dwelling cousins. And you're living in what might be the most dangerous ecosystem in Earth's history. The African Pleo-Pleistocene wasn't some peaceful grassland where early hominins gathered berries and occasionally threw rocks at each other. It was a nightmare factory of apex predators, all competing to see who could develop the most efficient ways to kill and eat things. And a slow, relatively defenseless bipedal ape? That's not a competitor, that's a snack. Let's meet some of your ancestors' neighbours. Dinophilis, the false saber-toothed cat, about the size of a modern jaguar but built specifically for killing primates. Their fossils show up in the same cave systems as early hominin remains, often with distinctive puncture wounds in primate skulls that match their teeth perfectly. Then there was Pachyrhina, the giant hyena. Modern hyenas are no joke, but these things were 400 pounds of bone-crushing predatory power. They could crack open elephant skulls. A hominin femur was basically a breadstick. Saber-toothed cats prowled the grasslands. Not the giant smilodon you see in movies, those came later and lived in the Americas, but African machaerodonts that were plenty large enough to consider you dinner. And if you managed to avoid the ground predators, there were things coming from above. Massive African crowned eagles with 6-foot wingspans and talons designed to punch through skulls. Modern versions of these eagles still hunt monkeys and small antelopes. The prehistoric versions were bigger and had millions of years of primate hunting experience. We know this wasn't theoretical danger because we've found the evidence. In 1924, a limestone quarry in South Africa yielded one of the most famous fossils in paleoanthropology, the Taung child, a skull of a young Australopithecus africanus maybe 3 years old when it died. For decades, people assumed it had just died naturally and been buried in the cave. Then researchers looked closer at the damage patterns on the skull. The puncture wounds matched eagle talons perfectly. The way the skull had been cracked open was consistent with how modern eagles feed. This child wasn't buried in the cave, it was carried there, by something with wings and very sharp feet that wanted to eat in peace. This discovery was part of a larger revolution in how we understand human evolution. For most of the 20th century, the dominant narrative was what anthropologists called man the hunter, the idea that human intelligence evolved because our ancestors became sophisticated predators, that we developed big brains to outsmart prey and coordinate hunts. It's a nice story. Makes us feel powerful. Only problem is, the evidence doesn't really support it. In the 1990s and early 2000s, anthropologists Donna, Hart and Robert Sussman developed what they called the man-the-hunted hypothesis. They compiled evidence from dozens of fossil sites showing that early hominins weren't apex predators. They were prey, and they were prey for a very long time. Australopithecus fossils show up with predator damage regularly. Puncture wounds, tooth marks, the distinctive crushing patterns of carnivore jaws. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a pattern extending across millions of years and thousands of miles. Think about what this means for how our ancestors lived. Every day was a calculation of risk. Where can we find food without exposing ourselves to predators? Where can we sleep without getting picked off? How do we protect the young, the elderly, the injured? And most crucially, what do we do when the sun goes down? Because here's where things got really dangerous. Most of the predators hunting early hominins were either nocturnal or crepuscular, meaning they were most active at dawn, dusk, and during the night. They had tapetum lucidum, that reflective layer behind the retina that makes animal eyes shine in the dark and allows them to see with minimal light. Your ancestors didn't have that. They had primate eyes, evolved for daytime color vision in the forest canopy, great for spotting ripe fruit in daylight, absolutely terrible for detecting a leopard stalking through tall grass at midnight. So when darkness fell, the predator-prey dynamic shifted dramatically. During the day, early hominins had some advantages. They could spot threats from a distance, coordinate responses, maybe throw rocks or wave sticks. But at night, they were effectively blind, while everything hunting them could see perfectly. This wasn't just occasionally stressful. This was every single night for millions of years, generation after generation living with the knowledge that darkness meant vulnerability, that sleep meant risk, that any sound in the night might be the last thing you ever heard. The ones who survived were the ones who stayed alert, who startled at sounds, who felt their hearts race in the darkness, who couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. And they passed those instincts down to you. Of all the creatures that hunted your ancestors through the African night, one stands apart. Not the biggest, not the strongest, but perhaps the most perfectly designed hominin killing machine evolution ever produced. The leopard. Modern leopards are impressive enough. Solitary ambush predators that can take down prey twice their size, drag it up a tree and cache it for later. But what makes them truly terrifying from a human perspective is their specialization. Leopards are primate hunters. They always have been. Their entire predatory strategy seems calibrated specifically for killing things like us. Start with their hunting behavior. Leopards are predominantly nocturnal. They do most of their hunting in complete darkness, using night vision that's roughly 7 times better than human eyesight. They move in absolute silence through terrain we'd stumble through making noise. Their spotted coat, which looks so distinctive in daylight, becomes perfect camouflage in the dappled shadows of moonlight filtering through trees. But here's what really matters. Leopards climb. Not just casually, we're talking about vertical rock faces, overhanging tree branches, anything a desperate primate might use to escape ground predators. And they're strong enough to carry prey heavier than themselves while climbing. This isn't just hunting ability. This is pursuit specialization. If you're a primate and you think you're safe because you climbed something, you're wrong. You've just trapped yourself exactly where a leopard wants you. Early hominins would have known this instinctively. Trees weren't safe. Caves weren't safe. The darkness itself wasn't safe. Because somewhere in that darkness, something was hunting that knew exactly how primates behaved when frightened. For decades, the fossil evidence supported this but couldn't quite prove it. Hominin bones showed damage, puncture wounds, crushing patterns. But attribution is tricky. Lots of carnivores leave similar marks. How do you prove which predator killed which hominin a million years ago? Then came Bob Brain and the Swartkrans caves. Brain was a South African paleontologist working in the fossil-rich cave systems northeast of Johannesburg in the 1960s and 70s. Swartkrans had already yielded dozens of early hominin fossils, mostly Australopithecus and early Homo species dating back nearly 2 million years. But Brain noticed something unusual. Some of the skulls had distinctive puncture wounds, pairs of holes spaced very precisely apart. Most researchers had assumed these were just general carnivore damage. Ancient hominins died, scavengers fed on the bodies, bones ended up in caves. That was the story. But Brain did something nobody had done before. He started collecting carnivore jaws from the same fossil layers: lions, hyenas, hunting dogs, and leopards. Then he got forensic about it. He measured the spacing between canine teeth in different predators. He analysed the size and shape of punctures in hominin skulls. He looked at bite angles and force patterns, and he found matches, perfect matches, between leopard jaws and hominin skulls. Not approximate, not could be. Perfect. The spacing between leopard canines matched the spacing between puncture wounds in hominin crania to the millimetre. The angle of penetration matched the arc of a leopard's bite. Even the size of the wounds matched the specific dimensions of leopard teeth from the same time period and location. Brain published his findings in the 1970s and 80s, and they fundamentally changed how anthropologists understood early human vulnerability. This wasn't speculation. This was forensic evidence that leopards had been killing and eating our ancestors for millions of years. But the story got darker, because Brain's work revealed something else, something that transforms how we think about caves in human evolution. We tend to imagine caves as shelters, places where early humans huddled for protection from the elements and predators, safe havens where families could sleep and children could play. Except many of the caves where we find hominin fossils weren't human shelters. They were leopard lairs. Leopards cache their kills. After making a kill, they'll often drag the carcass to a secure location. A cave, a rocky overhang, somewhere they can feed without competition from other predators. And Swartkrans shows clear evidence of this behaviour. The cave contains layers of accumulated prey bones spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Antelope, baboons, and hominins, all mixed together, all showing similar damage patterns, all apparently brought there by the same predator across geological time. The implications are haunting. Some of those hominin fossils we've been studying, the ones that have told us so much about human evolution, they weren't people who lived in the cave. They were people who died in the cave, carried there in a leopard's jaws, partially consumed in the darkness, their bones left behind to fossilize alongside the remains of countless other prey items. Your ancestor's skull, with your ancestor's brain inside, becoming dinner for something that had learned over millions of years exactly how to hunt primates in the dark. And this pattern wasn't unique to Swartkrans. As researchers started looking at other cave sites with Brain's forensic approach, they found similar evidence across Africa. Leopard predation on hominins wasn't occasional. It was systematic, sustained. A relationship stretching back to before we were even recognizably human. Try to imagine what this meant experientially. The place that looks like shelter, the dark enclosed space that feels safe, is actually the place where the predator lives, where it brings its kills, where it feeds. Caves weren't sanctuaries, they were death traps. And somewhere deep in your ancestors' psychology, in the instincts that got passed down generation after generation, that knowledge became embedded. Darkness is dangerous. Enclosed spaces in darkness are more dangerous. And that feeling that something is watching you from the shadows, that's not paranoia. That's genetic memory from a time when something absolutely was watching, waiting, deciding whether you were worth the effort. The leopard didn't just hunt your ancestors, it shaped them, shaped their behaviour, their choices, their fear responses. For millions of years, a silent killer stalked through the night, perfectly adapted to murder primates. And the primates that survived were the ones who never quite shook the feeling that the darkness was full of teeth. The leopard wasn't hunting alone. Imagine the African night 2 million years ago. Not the sanitized version you see in nature documentaries, but the raw sensory experience your ancestors endured. Total darkness punctuated only by starlight or the occasional moon. And in that darkness, an entire guild of specialized predators, all converging on the same vulnerable prey base. Primates, including your ancestors. The leopard was terrifying, but it was just one nightmare among many. The African savanna after sunset became a killing field, orchestrated by multiple predators, each with their own hunting strategy, each perfectly adapted to exploit hominin weakness in different ways. Start with the hyenas, not the modern spotted hyenas we know today, impressive as those are. We're talking about their ancestor, Pachyrhocutta brevirostris, the giant short-faced hyena. This thing was a monster, somewhere between 250 and 400 pounds, with a skull the size of a lion's and jaws powerful enough to crack open elephant bones. Paleontologists have found Pachyrhocutta remains at the same sites as early hominins across Africa and Eurasia. Same territories, same time periods, same fossil layers. But here's what made Pachyrhocutta uniquely dangerous. Modern hyenas are often portrayed as cowardly scavengers, but that's Hollywood nonsense. They're sophisticated cooperative hunters, and Pachyrhocutta would have been the same, only bigger, stronger, and more aggressive. They hunted in clans, they operated primarily at night, and they had bone-crushing jaws that could obliterate anything they caught. For a lone hominin or even a small family group, encountering a Pachyrhocutta clan in darkness would have been a death sentence. No tree would help you. These weren't climbers, but they didn't need to be. They could wait. And they hunted cooperatively enough to surround defensive positions. The fossil evidence shows they fed on early hominins. Bite marks on hominin bones match Pachyrhocutta dental patterns. They weren't just incidental predators. They were part of the regular threat matrix that shaped hominin behavior for over 1 million years. Then there were the cats, not just leopards. The African night was full of specialized felids, some of which seem to have focused specifically on primate prey. Dinophilis, the terrible cat, built somewhere between a leopard and a lion, with shortened, flattened skulls and massive canine teeth. Paleontologists have been arguing for decades about whether Dinophilis was a specialized hominin predator. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. Dinophilis remains show up consistently at sites with hominin fossils, not just nearby, but in direct association. The famous site at Swartkrans where leopard predation was documented also contained Dinophilis specimens. So did sites like Kromdraai and Sterkfontein. Some researchers think this is coincidence. Same habitat, same time period, bound to overlap. But others point to Dinophilis anatomy. Those shortened jaws and robust teeth weren't optimized for the kind of prey other big cats took down. They seemed designed for something specific. Something that required less running speed and more grappling power. Something like primates, who took refuge in trees and rocky areas where a bulkier, more powerful build would be advantageous. The debate continues, but one thing's certain. Dinophilis was there, hunting in the same darkness where your ancestors tried to survive. And whether or not it specialized in hominins, it absolutely killed them when opportunities arose. Meganterion was there too, another saber-toothed cat slightly smaller than Dinophilis, but with even more impressive canines. Proportionally built more like an ambush predator than a pursuit hunter. The kind of animal that would wait motionless in darkness near a water source or a known travel route, then explode into violence when prey passed close enough. For hominins moving through unfamiliar territory in low light, this was predation roulette. You couldn't see the threat until it was already in motion, already committed to the kill. And while we're cataloguing nocturnal horrors, we need to talk about something most people don't consider when they imagine early human predation risk. Snakes. Not small snakes, not even medium snakes, massive pythons. The fossil record from Pleistocene Africa includes python specimens over 20 feet long, constricting predators that hunted by ambush, operating equally well in darkness, capable of killing prey far larger than themselves by suffocation. This brings us to something fascinating that neuroscientist Lynne Isbell proposed in the early 2000s. The snake detection theory. Isbell argued that primate visual systems didn't evolve primarily for social recognition or food finding. They evolved to detect camouflaged predators, specifically snakes. Look at primate vision compared to other mammals. We have exceptional spatial resolution. We're incredibly good at detecting edges, patterns, and movement in cluttered visual environments. We have extensive neural circuits dedicated to visual processing, and crucially, multiple studies have shown that both human children and non-human primates can detect snake images faster than any other stimulus, even spiders or other threatening animals. This happens so quickly it appears to be pre-attentive, processed before conscious awareness. Isbell's theory suggests this isn't cultural, it's evolutionary. Primates have been dealing with venomous and constricting snakes for tens of millions of years, long before big cats, long before we came down from the trees, and the ones who survived were the ones whose brains got slightly better at detecting that subtle S-curve in the grass, that unusual pattern in the shadows, that specific texture that means snake, even when everything else says just vegetation. For early hominins spending more time on the ground, this ancient primate adaptation became even more critical, because unlike leopards or hyenas, which you might hear or smell, a large python lying motionless in darkness is almost impossible to detect until you're already within striking range. Now combine all these threats into a single experience. It's 3 hours after sunset, no moon. You're part of a small family group trying to reach a rocky outcrop before full darkness. You can't see 10 feet in front of you. Somewhere in the blackness you hear the bone-cracking sounds of hyenas feeding. Closer, maybe 50 yards away, something large is moving through the grass. No sound. Just the displacement of air and the faint scent of musk and old blood that might be leopard or might be Dinophalis or might be something worse. Your group huddles together. Nobody speaks. Speaking would give away your exact position. You reach the outcrop, but is it safety or is it where the predators wait? You can't know. You can only press yourself against the rock and hope that whatever is out there chooses different prey tonight. The fossil evidence tells us that sometimes hope wasn't enough. Sometimes the darkness won. And the ones who survived long enough to become your ancestors were the ones who never, not for one moment, forgot that after sunset they stopped being the dominant species on the landscape. They became prey, and the night belonged to the hunters. By this point in the story, something important has happened. The fear is no longer just out there in the grass, in the shape of hyenas and saber-tooths and coiled pythons. It has moved inside, into the nervous system of a small primate trying to survive long enough to reproduce. This is where paleontology hands the baton to neuroscience. When you stack 2 million years of nighttime predation on top of each other, generation after generation, you don't just get better leopards, you get different brains. The hominins who treated darkness casually, who strolled away from the fire at night, who didn't feel that growing unease when the last light faded, they didn't leave many descendants. The ones who did are the ones whose nervous systems overreacted. They jumped at shadows. They huddled closer to others after dusk. They felt watched, even when they couldn't see anything at all. You carry their wiring. Inside your skull, 2 almond-shaped structures sit deep in the temporal lobes, the amygdalae. You can think of them as ancient threat detection modules, tuned by millions of years of being almost but not quite eaten. Most parts of your brain like to take their time. They integrate information, weigh possibilities, consider context. The amygdala is not like that. It's fast, crude, paranoid. It gets a rough, low-resolution version of sensory input before your conscious mind ever sees the high-definition version. Vision scientists sometimes call this the low road to fear. Light hits your eyes, signals travel through the optic nerve, and before your visual cortex has politely assembled the scene, tree, rock, friend, horizon, the amygdala has already received a quick and dirty summary. Dark, movement, unknown. If that summary crosses a certain threshold, the amygdala doesn't wait for a second opinion. It slams a hand down on the alarm, heart rate up, breathing shallower, muscles primed, attention narrowed. You get the familiar sensation. Something's wrong. I don't know what it is, but something is wrong. In bright daylight, the rest of your brain can usually step in. The visual cortex refines the image. The prefrontal cortex, the planning, reasoning part, says, "Relax, it's just a tree." The amygdala backs down. False alarm. No harm done. But darkness breaks that system. Your eyes were never designed for the night. Not really. Compared to true nocturnal predators, human scotopic vision under low-light conditions, is embarrassingly bad. You do have rods in your retina, the light-sensitive cells that work in dim conditions. They're more sensitive than cones, the color-detecting cells that operate in daylight. At night, your rods take over. Your world turns grainy, colorless, high contrast. Shapes blur, edges soften, movement smears across your field of view. For an owl or a cat, this isn't a problem. They've packed their retinas with rods, enlarged their pupils, built sophisticated tapetum lucidum reflectors to bounce photons back through the retina twice. Evolution spent millions of years turning their eyes into night vision devices. It did not do that for you. Your ancestors' eyes are a compromise. Good enough to spot snakes in dappled leaves, good enough to read subtle social cues on daylight faces, not good enough to confidently map a moonless savannah. And here's the crucial thing. Your brain knows this. Not in words, not in conscious thought, but in calibration. Deep neural circuits silently track how reliable your senses are at any given moment. In low light, the error bars widen. The world becomes uncertain, and uncertainty in a nervous system built under predation is never neutral. So the amygdala adjusts its thresholds. In daylight, it might need a clear outline, a definite motion pattern, the unmistakable profile of a big cat to fire the alarm. In darkness, it lowers its standards dramatically. A rustle is enough, a suggestion of movement, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. Sometimes not even that. Sometimes mere absence of information feels like threat. That's when the rest of your body gets drafted into the night shift. Cortisol levels edge upward. Not enough to feel like full-blown panic, just enough to make sleep shallower, muscles tenser, thoughts a little more vigilant. Your pupils dilate to drag every last photon out of the dark, though it doesn't help much. Auditory processing gets a performance boost. The brainstem and auditory cortex start privileging faint, irregular sounds. You find yourself straining to hear, giving more weight to creaks, distant footsteps, wind through grass that in daytime you'd ignore completely. The feeling of being watched is what that internal state subjectively feels like. It's not that you're necessarily being watched. It's that your threat detection system, tuned by bodies that were watched, that were stalked from the shadows for hundreds of thousands of nights, has quietly shifted into a higher gear. Modern neuroscience can actually measure this shift. Put adults in a lab, hook them up to electrodes that track the startle response, the reflexive whole-body flinch when you hear a sudden loud noise, then turn the lights down. Not horror movie dark, just enough that visual information becomes uncertain. Play the same sudden sound. The startle reflex becomes bigger. More intense muscle contraction, higher skin conductance, stronger amygdala activation in brain scans. All from the same sound, in the same safe room, with the only difference being the lights. Other experiments do something even simpler. Show people images of ambiguous, potentially threatening scenes, a shadowy figure in a hallway, a path through dense forest, and manipulate brightness. As luminance drops, reported anxiety rises. Reaction times to detect targets speed up, but accuracy doesn't improve. The brain is trading precision for readiness. It's saying, I'd rather be wrong and fast than right and dead. We see the same pattern across cultures, across ages, even in people who say they love the dark and don't consider themselves fearful. The physiology disagrees. Deep down, the system is still doing the math. Night equals risk. And yet, not all fear is equally baked in. Psychologists talk about learned fears versus prepared fears. Learned fears are things your environment teaches you. You can be conditioned to fear a neutral object, a specific sound, a shape, even a colour, if it's repeatedly paired with something unpleasant. That's classical conditioning. Prepared fears are different. They're biases built into the nervous system long before you're born. They're the result of evolutionary history, not personal history. You weren't born in a savannah lit by hydrogen street lamps and LED billboards. You were born into a world where darkness meant an abrupt drop in your odds of survival, where unseen predators had a dramatic influence on who got to leave genes in the next generation. So the human nervous system is prepared to fear certain categories of things: heights, snakes, spiders, confined spaces, and the absence of light. You don't need to be taught that these are risky. Culture can amplify or dampen them, but it didn't create them from scratch. Notice how this plays out with modern dangers. Automobiles kill vast numbers of people every year. Electrical outlets and household chemicals are lethal if mishandled. But toddlers don't instinctively shrink away from parked cars or plugged-in sockets the way they do from a dark hallway. You have to repeatedly tell them, don't touch that, that's dangerous. The fear is installed after the fact. Darkness is different. Children all over the world develop fear of the dark at roughly the same ages, often without any obvious trauma or scary stories to trigger it. They refuse to sleep without a light. They worry about things under the bed, in the closet just outside the window. Parents sometimes treat this as a silly phase. an overactive imagination that needs to be gently corrected. From an evolutionary perspective, it looks more like a scheduled software update. Around the time, children historically would have started moving slightly farther from constant adult supervision, exploring, playing at the edge of camp, being trusted to fetch water or firewood. Their brains turn on an ancient script. Be more careful when the light goes. Stay close. Don't wander. Imagine worst-case scenarios, because in this domain, false alarms are cheap and real alarms are fatal. The monsters in the closet are not random. They are clumsy, cultural masks draped over something much older. The statistical memory of leopards in trees, hyenas circling, snakes coiled in burrows you can't see into. As we move forward in the story, to fire, to myth, to cities that never sleep, keep this in mind. Every time you feel that slight unease in a dark room, every time a child begs for a nightlight, you're not just seeing superstition. You're watching 2 million years of night on the savannah light up the amygdala and whisper, very quietly, "It's dark again. Be ready." By the time your ancestors' amygdala had been tuned into those sensitive tripwires, something else had begun creeping into the story. A glow, not the cold, distant glow of stars they could never touch, but a small, dangerous sun dragged down to earth. Controllable, at least sometimes. Feedable, persuadable. Something that could push the dark back a few arm lengths. Fire. We don't know the exact night it happened first. There is no fossil of the first terrified, fascinated primate standing too close to a lightning-struck tree, but the archaeological record gives us a rough outline of when that flirtation turned into a relationship. Deep inside Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, in layers about 1 million years old, archaeologists have found microscopic traces of burned bone and ash. Not at the cave's entrance where wildfires might blow in, but far inside, in places where natural fires rarely reach. The bones are heated to temperatures that suggest controlled burning, not just random scorching. Hundreds of thousands of years later, at a site called Gesher Beno Yaakov in what is now Israel, around 790,000 years ago, we see something even more suggestive. Clusters of burned flint and charred plant remains in concentrated patches, as if small hearths had been arranged and tended over and over in the same spots by the same kind of hands. There is still debate about how early true fire control began. Some researchers argue that Homo erectus, the tall, long-legged hominin that roamed Africa and Eurasia, starting about 1.9 million years ago, was already a fire user, maybe even a firekeeper. Others think those early traces might be opportunistic, scavenging natural fires, not yet mastering the art of making flames on demand. But by the time of Wonderwerk and Gesher Benot Yaakov, something had clearly shifted. Fire wasn't just an occasional visitor, it was becoming a tool, and not just a daytime tool. For a nervous system marinated in nighttime terror, that matters. Imagine what the world looked like before: sunset, and then nothing. The sky goes from blue to gold to black, and unless there is a bright moon, vision drops to a smear of silhouettes and guesses. The savannah doesn't get quieter, it gets louder. Hyenas whoop, lions call, insects and frogs and nightbirds take over the soundscape. Every rustle could be a predator's paw. Then imagine that same world with a controlled fire. Now there is a circle. Inside the circle, light, warmth, faces. Outside the circle, the same infinite black full of teeth and unknowns. But the boundary is different now. To many predators, fire is a novel, frightening thing. They keep their distance. Their night vision, so superior to yours, is dazzled at the edge of the glare. The predator-prey equation tilts, just a little. Before fire, your ancestors' safety strategy was simple. Climb, hide, cling to each other, hope. After fire, they can create a zone of relative safety on the ground. They can choose where to sleep. They can burn off parasites in bedding, scare snakes away from sleeping hollows, keep the worst of the cold at bay. This doesn't make them invincible. Plenty of big cats learn to skirt firelight. Sparks can travel. Flames can turn on you. But on balance, in terms of survival mathematics, a maintained hearth is worth a lot of nervous systems. And fire doesn't just change the night, it stretches it. Daylight hours are limited. Without artificial light, the window for foraging, hunting, tool-making and social negotiation is narrow. When you bring fire into the picture, you effectively lengthen the day. You create off-peak hours, time after sunset that is no longer pure vulnerability. What do you do with those extra hours? You can't hunt much in the glare. Most prey sees you coming. You can't wander too far. The safe zone is small. So you sit. You tend the flames. You fix tools. You share food. You look at each other's faces in a way that's harder in direct noonlight. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years studying modern hunter-gatherer groups like the Juhwanzi in southern Africa, recording their conversations by day and by night. Her work suggests that firelight fundamentally changes what people talk about. By day, speech is practical. Who hunted what, where the water is, who owes whom a favour. It's task-focused, immediate, anchored to the visible world. By night, around the fire, something else happens. Conversation turns to stories, myths, past hunts, relationships, moral dramas, what-ifs. People talk about absent others, spirits, ancestors, plans for the future. Imagination stretches beyond the here and now. Wiesner calls this the social and imaginative expansion of firelight, a kind of social brain by firelight effect. The dim, flickering illumination creates both intimacy and abstraction. Faces are half seen, shadows dance on cave walls, and the brain is freed from constant scanning for immediate threats. There is finally cognitive bandwidth to simulate, to remember, to invent. Over evolutionary time, those extra hours matter. Groups that use them to solidify alliances, rehearse knowledge, transmit skills, and knit collective memory together will outcompete groups that simply sleep as soon as the sun goes down. Children who grow up bathed in stories at the hearth learn the rules of their society in layered, emotionally charged narratives. Adults subtly negotiate status and cooperation in the glow. In that sense, fire isn't just a physical technology. It's a social one. It creates a predictable, shared focus of attention. Everyone can see the same flames, feel the same heat. That shared focus is fertile ground for complex language to flourish. You can gesture into the darkness and have everyone understand the imagined line you're describing, because the fire gives you a safe platform from which to project danger outward. This may have been one of the engines that drove the evolution of our oversized, socially attuned brains. A nervous system that spends all its nights clinging silently to a tree trunk doesn't need intricate gossip protocols or elaborate myths. A nervous system that spends its nights in a ring of light, talking, remembering, planning, does. And then there is the subjective revolution. For millions of years, darkness had been an absolute. When the sun went down, your ancestors seeded the world. It belonged to other eyes, other teeth. They could respond, hide, clutch their offspring a little tighter, but they could not push back. Fire changed that emotional geometry. For the first time, the night was no longer a single, undifferentiated threat. It had structure, a near safe zone and a far unsafe beyond. The psychological effect must have been enormous. Inside the ring, the amygdala could relax a notch. Heart rates could slow, laughter could surface, stories of past dangers could be told in the past tense instead of simply felt in the present. Outside the ring, in the bushes just beyond the light, the old fear condensed, perhaps even sharpened. The contrast made it more visible. Imagine being a child in one of those early fire-using bands. You fall asleep to the sound of crackling wood and adult voices, the smell of smoke tangling with the scent of the night. You know the rule, learned deep in your bones, do not step beyond the light. The darkness is not just absence, it is a place that contains specific things, the eyes that sometimes glint back from the blackness, the growls you've heard, the screams you were told about. Your body is learning something new. Safety is not a binary. It comes in gradients, and one of those gradients is made of light. Fire also reprograms hunger. Cooked food is softer, easier to chew, safer to digest. Some researchers argue that regular cooking, enabled by habitual fire use, allowed our ancestors to extract more energy from their food, supporting larger brains and longer childhoods. If that's right, then the same flame that kept leopards at bay may also have been feeding the neural hardware that makes fear of the dark such a vivid internal experience. But for all its power, fire never erased that fear. It couldn't. The circle of light is always finite. Beyond it, the uncertainty begins again. In fact, the very brightness of the fire makes the darkness past a certain distance even harder to see into. Your pupils constrict in the glare. making the invisible just beyond it more impenetrable. Predators can learn. Hyenas can wait quietly outside the glow, watching, sniffing, choosing their moment. Snakes are indifferent to flame at a distance. Other humans, increasingly one of the most dangerous presences in the landscape, can lurk just beyond that shimmering edge. So fire becomes a way to manage the fear, not abolish it. You move closer to the flames when you hear something in the brush. You add more wood. You sleep with your feet toward the warmth, your face toward the dark, half dozing, half listening. The old circuitry is still running, still whispering, "Don't trust the black." Over tens of thousands of generations, this dance between light and dark, fire and fear, writes itself into our myths, our rituals, our sense of what home feels like. A home is a place with a controlled light in the night, whether it's a hearth, a candle, or a small electric bulb glowing in a child's bedroom. The predator-filled night that sculpted your brain did not disappear when the first ember was tamed. It stepped back to the edge of the light and waited there. And in that narrow zone, where safety ends and imagination begins, new creatures started to form. Not of muscle and fang, but of memory and story. Once those new creatures appeared, they were very hard to get rid of. Because they weren't just made of imagination. They were made of something older, heavier, memory. Not your memory. Not even your grandparents. The memory of nervous systems that had spent millions of nights listening for claws in the dark. As real predation began to decline in some places, as fire, weapons, dogs, walls, and finally cities pushed the big cats and scavengers further away, the fear didn't just evaporate. Nervous systems don't update that fast. Brains wired to survive don't say, "Oh, lions are rare now, let's uninstall that module." Instead, the fear did something more subtle. It migrated. The direct line between rustle in the grass equals maybe leopard softened, but the reaction remained, looking for targets, attaching itself to shadows, to rumours, to stories. The predators moved out of the immediate environment and into the shared space of culture. They became mythology. Across the world, in cultures that never met each other, that never traded a word, we see the same shapes prowling at the edges of human stories. Wolves, big cats, serpents, birds of prey. It's as if the brain, handed a blank canvas and told draw danger, keeps reaching for the same template. Call it the predator template. Think of it like this. Evolution doesn't store detailed high-resolution images of every threat. It stores rough patterns, eye shine at low angles, forward-facing gaze, sudden rustle, sinusoidal movement like a snake, the silhouette of a large quadruped. A shadow passing overhead with hooked beak and claws. Those patterns, reinforced again and again by who survived and who didn't, settle into the architecture of the visual system, the auditory system, the amygdala. Fast preconscious recognition systems. If something from the environment matches the template, alarms go off. When cultures start telling stories, those same templates get reused. It's efficient. When you tell a child about a monster with glaring eyes and sharp teeth in the dark, you're plugging into circuitry that is already waiting. You can see this in specific traditions. In parts of West Africa, there were, and in some cases remain, beliefs and secret societies centered around what colonial observers called leopard men. These weren't just symbolic. There were real people who dressed in spotted skins, used claws or hooked blades, attacked at night. But around those acts grew a larger mythos. Human-leopard hybrids, shapeshifters, spirits that walked on the edge between person and predator. Why leopard, and not, say, antelope? Because for thousands of years, leopards were the ones that slipped silently into the edge of the firelight, the ones that could climb trees to reach sleeping bodies, the ones whose kill sign, the dragged carcass, the neat puncture wounds at the throat, became burned into local experience. Over time, that pattern expanded. The leopard was no longer just an animal. It was a way of talking about stealth, power, the terror of being stalked, a memory of being prey, stretched into a social and spiritual symbol. Move thousands of miles and several millennia to ancient Mesopotamia, and you find something similar in a different costume. The night was populated with beings that were not quite gods, not quite animals, but something in between. Man-eating demons, storm spirits, child snatchers, figures like Lamashtu, often depicted with a lioness's head, donkey's teeth, talons of a bird of prey, who prowled the darkness, especially threatening women in childbirth and newborns. This is a composite predator if there ever was one. Big cat jaws, raptor claws, hybrid, unnatural but made of real parts, all drawn from the catalogue of things that once tore human bodies apart. People in ancient cities like and Nineveh had walls. They had guards. They had lamps. But they also had a nightlife of anxiety. Disease, sudden infant death, raiders slipping through the gates, jackals and lions beyond the cultivated land. The external threats and the internal ones blurred, and the brain did what it always does, personified them, gave them faces that matched the predator template. In the far north, among the Norse, wolves took centre stage. Wolves, by the time the sagas were being told, were nuisances more than existential threats to most settled communities. They stole livestock. They howled from the forest. But in the myths, they became apocalyptic. Fenrir, the monstrous wolf, is chained by the gods because of a prophecy that he will one day break free and devour Odin, plunging the world into Ragnarok. His offspring, Shirl and Hati, chase the sun and moon through the sky, destined to finally catch and swallow them in the final doom. Think about that for a moment. The end of the world envisioned as prey being caught by predator. The cosmic order, sun, moon, king of the gods, is not toppled by an abstraction or an impersonal force, but by a big, hungry carnivore with jaws wide enough to swallow the sky. That's a very old memory speaking. A sense that no matter how high you climb, something with teeth can always reach you. And then there are the creatures that seem almost too universal to be coincidence. Dragons. They appear in China, Mesopotamia, India, Europe, Mesoamerica, in forms that differ in personality and meaning, but share a striking visual core. Long bodies, scales, fangs, often wings, often breath of fire or poison, sometimes guarding waterholes, hoards of treasure or sacred spaces. One influential idea is that dragons are cultural mashups of three ancient predator classes that terrified early primates long before we were human: big cats, raptors, and snakes. From big cats, the dragon gets its forward-facing predator eyes, its roar, its sense of ambush and pursuit. From raptors, eagles, hawks, vultures, it inherits wings, talons, the ability to strike from above. From snakes, it gets its sinuous body, its scales, its venom, its association with hidden danger underfoot. Take those three, compress them into one impossible creature, and what you have is a kind of ultimate ancestral threat. A being that can strike from the ground, from trees, from the sky, that can bite, claw, constrict, poison, burn. Dozens of generations of children listening to stories by firelight learn the word for that creature: dragon, naga, lung, Quetzalcoatl. They feel the shiver those tales produce. Their amygdalae, primed for millions of years to respond to certain shapes and movements, light up even though the dragon has never existed in their environment. In this sense, mythology is not random invention. It is selective memory, amplified. And at the smaller scale, you can see the same process in something very familiar: bedtime stories. Long before bedtime story meant a printed book, it meant whatever the elders chose to say to the children drowsing around the fire's edge. Not all of these were gentle. Many cultures have bogeymen, night hags, forest spirits, ogres, witches, raw-head and bloody bones equivalents, whose job is, quite transparently, to scare kids into obedience. Don't stray from the path. Don't go near the river at night. Don't wander into the forest alone. Don't look under the water reeds. Don't step beyond the light. On the surface, these are moral tales. Obey your parents, respect taboos, listen to the elders. Underneath, they are hazard maps, encoded in narrative. The bogeyman in the river weeds is there because crocodiles and hippos once lived there. The demon in the forest shadows wears the face of a leopard, a tiger, a bear, even if the storyteller now calls it something else. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes a brutal kind of sense. A child who is mildly traumatized by tales of monsters in the dark and therefore stays close to camp at night is more likely to survive than the child who feels only curiosity and wanders out to see what's making that rustling sound. Over generations, families and cultures that used effective stories to transmit these invisible rules may have had a small but real survival edge. The stories that scared children just enough, not so much that they froze completely but enough to keep them wary, persisted. The others were forgotten, so the monsters stayed. They crouched at the edge of the crib in lullabies, in whispered warnings, in the half-humorous threats adults make when a child won't go to bed. They lurked in the margins of epics and scriptures, in fairy tales and folk tales, always just outside the safe circle. By the time real lions and leopards had been pushed far from most human settlements, you didn't need to have seen one to be afraid of the dark around your house. You had inherited 1,000 generations of other people's nights. You had, in your mind, a bestiary assembled from echoes, claws, eyes, fangs, wings, coils, hunger. And that bestiary was powerful enough that even when the forest were cleared, and the walls were high, and the street lamps came on, it didn't go away. In the Middle Ages, in Europe at least, the physical night returned in force, thick, unlit, pressing in on the narrow glow of candles. And into that renewed darkness those ancient inherited shapes flowed again, dressed now in new theology and new fears. The long night of human history wasn't over. It had just changed costumes. In the Middle Ages, after sunset, the world did something modern people almost never see anymore. It went away. Not in the theatrical sense we imagine when we think of a dark room. Not the darkness you get when you turn off the lights and your eyes slowly adjust, and you can still see the outline of the furniture, the faint glow of a charger, the thin leakage from the street. This was a darkness that swallowed horizons. Step outside a medieval house in winter, on a moonless night, and the line between sky and earth dissolved. The road in front of you ceased to exist a few steps from your door. Forests became a single, continuous block of ink. Clouds made even starlight vanish. If you moved away from flame, you moved into something that felt almost physical, a pressure, a presence. For most people, there was no such thing as ambient light. No neon in the distance, no airplane beacons, no highway glow. A single candle in a window might be the brightest thing for miles. We sometimes underestimate that. We live in what historians call a light-saturated environment. Even when we think it's dark, it's actually full of photons. For your medieval ancestors, nighttime meant the return of almost absolute visual blindness. Inside, things weren't much better. Tallow lamps, rushlights, a few candles if you could afford them. Smoky, dim, and expensive. Candles took labour and animal fat and beeswax. You didn't waste them to make rooms cosy. You burned them only when necessary. Much of the year people simply surrendered to the dark, but they didn't sleep through it in the way we imagine. The historian Roger Kirsch, going through court records, diaries, letters, and medical texts, began to notice odd phrases that kept appearing from the late Middle Ages into the early modern period. People would casually mention their first sleep and second sleep, as if everyone knew what that meant, because everyone did. Before industrial clocks and bright artificial lighting, it seems many humans in Europe, and probably elsewhere, didn't sleep in a single 8-hour block. They lay down not long after dusk and slipped into what they called first sleep. Then, somewhere around midnight, in that deep centre of the night, they woke up. Not fully, not always dramatically, but regularly. For an hour, sometimes 2. This wasn't insomnia. It was normal. They used this interval, this watch, in the heart of the darkness for all sorts of things. Quiet conversation, prayer, sex, reading. If they were literate and rich enough to have candles, checking on animals, tending the fire, occasionally slipping outdoors to look at the sky, to use the latrine, to do something they didn't want the rest of the household to see. Then they went back to bed, drifting into their second sleep until dawn. Modern sleep labs, when they take volunteers away from electric light and let night fall naturally, often see something similar. The brain seems quite content with a segmented pattern when it isn't forced into a strict clock-driven day, as if, under the surface, we still carry the template for those 2 sleeps, divided by a small island of wakefulness under the stars. But that island was not always peaceful, because outside the fragile glow of hearths and lamps, the medieval night was still dangerous. The big cats and hyenas that had haunted early humans were mostly gone from Europe by then, pushed back into shrinking pockets of wilderness or exterminated altogether. Bears and wolves lingered, but they were rarer, wary of people, more interested in livestock than humans themselves. The predators hadn't vanished, though. They had changed species. In crowded medieval and early modern towns, the most dangerous creature in the dark was increasingly other people, Streets were narrow, surfaces were rough, open sewers ran along the sides of lanes. Livestock, carts, refuse, all of it blended into a chaotic obstacle course. Without light, injury was easy. A wrong step into a ditch, a misjudged bridge, a stumble on slick cobblestone could cripple you. Then there was fire. Every home used open flame, for heat, for cooking, for light. Roofs were often thatch, walls were wood and wattle. A single overturned candle, a dropped ember, a drunk or drowsy resident forgetting to bank the coals properly could ignite an entire block. At night, when people were asleep and reaction time slowed, a blaze could race through a town before anyone had a chance to fight it. So the night was feared as the time of burning, just as much as the time of lurking, and around all of that, crime. Bandits on the roads waited for the last travellers who misjudged the sunset, and found themselves still outside the walls. Thieves and cut-purses used the dark to move unseen. Assault, robbery, revenge killings. Human violence slipped into the hours when identification was hardest and witnesses were few. Medieval and early modern city authorities weren't naive about this. They treated the night as an enemy to be managed. Town gates were locked at sunset or shortly after. If you weren't in, you stayed out, exposed on the road, sleeping in ditches or in dubious inns. Inside the walls, curfews were common. Bells rang to signal the time when decent people were expected to be home and off the streets. Night watchmen patrolled the lanes, calling the hours, rattling keys, sometimes carrying lanterns, sometimes nothing more than a staff in their own nerve. Their job was to spot fires early, to challenge strangers, to keep a minimal sense of order. But they couldn't be everywhere. They were often old, poorly paid, occasionally drunk or asleep. So the deeper it got into the night, the more the urban landscape reverted to something older. A patchwork of small islands of guarded light in a sea of shadow. That was the physical side of it. Layered over that was something more invisible but just as powerful. A thick web of spiritual and cultural fear. Darkness was rarely just the absence of light in medieval minds. It was a moral and metaphysical state. Night was when witches flew, when demons walked, when the dead were restless, when the devil prowled like a roaring lion, as one often quoted line of scripture had it. In Europe, confessions extracted under torture, pamphlets, and sermons are full of nighttime scenes, witches gathering at crossroads under the new moon, Sabbaths on remote hillsides, secret rites held in forests far from the village. Whether or not such meetings ever actually happened the way they were described, the imagination placed them firmly in the hours when sun and priest and neighbourly eyes were gone. In parts of West and Central Africa, night was likewise a liminal time. Spirits of the bush, ancestors, beings that lived between human and animal, all were thought to be more active when the world went dark. Witchcraft accusations, oral tales, divination rituals, again and again, the dangerous, the ambiguous, the morally charged events clustered around night. Across much of Asia, similar patterns appear. In Chinese folk belief, yin, associated with darkness, cold, and the feminine, was strongest at night. Ghost festivals, hungry spirits, demons at the crossroads, they emerged with the setting sun. In South and Southeast Asia, stories of Rakshasas, Butts, Pontianaks, Jinn took on their sharpest edge after dusk. People did not simply think, "It's dark, I can't see." They thought, "It's dark, the boundary is thin." And under those beliefs something older was still humming, that ancestral association between darkness and being prey. If anything, the new theology and folklore made it worse, because now the predators of the dark weren't limited by biology. A wolf's eyes can only see so far, a leopard's claws can only reach so high. But a demon's gaze, a witch's curse, those could pass through walls, slip through keyholes, ride the wind. The old templates, glowing eyes, grasping hands, sudden movement in the periphery, were reskinned with horns, hooves, wings, shadow cloaks. The amygdala doesn't care if the shape you're imagining is catalogued as leopard or incubus. It only cares that it fits the pattern. Something might tear you apart. By the late Middle Ages, across much of Europe, the big cats were gone and wolves were under pressure. The forest line was retreating. Agricultural land was expanding. But in the human nervous system, and in the shared stories passed around hearths and in churchyards, the night remained thick with hunters. Only now the teeth that people feared most were often human. A stranger on the road, a neighbour with a grudge, a band of mercenaries outside the town walls, a landlord's men enforcing debts, a witch-hunting mob with torches. The Middle Ages were a long experiment in what happens when ancient nocturnal fear is poured into a new social container. Real dangers: theft, assault, fire, sudden illness, childbirth gone wrong, plague carts rattling through streets before dawn, kept the association between darkness and death brutally current. You didn't need lions anymore to teach you to fear the hours when you couldn't see. Every scream in the night, every unexplained sickness that struck a sleeping child, every crackle of flames in the rafters reinforced the lesson. Day was for work and visibility and order. Night was for vulnerability. As the centuries went by, people would begin to push back. They would hang more lanterns, invent new ways of making flame steady and bright, slowly extend the waking day into what had once been unsafe time. But for a long while yet, the old pattern held. The sun went down, and human beings, heirs of 1,000,000 years of being hunted in the dark, lay down between first sleep and second, listening to every creak, every distant shout, every dog's bark echoing through streets that belonged once again to the predators. The first counterattack was small, not a blazing victory, not a floodlight, just a wick dipped in rendered fat. For most of history, light after sunset was a luxury that burned. Every extra hour you could see cost you something. Beeswax from hives, tallow from slaughtered animals, oil pressed from olives or hauled up from underground. When you lit a candle, you were literally setting food and labour on fire. So people rationed it. In a poor medieval cottage, a single rushlight might sputter on the table. A twist of dried plant stem dipped in grease, smoking, dim, gone in less than an hour. The flame didn't really conquer the dark. It carved out a thumbprint of visibility in a vast surrounding ocean. Even in castles and monasteries, where candles were more plentiful, the light was patchy. Pools of brightness around altars and desks, long corridors swallowed up just a few steps away. Wealth let you push the shadows back, but only to a point. Over centuries, people got better at managing flame. Wicks were braided more cleverly. Lamps were shaped to catch and reflect what little light they made. Glassworkers learned to craft clearer, thinner panes so lanterns could shine a bit farther. But the basic rule remained. After dark, light was dear. You went to bed early not because you were healthier or more virtuous, but because every extra hour awake was an hour of fuel burned. Then, very slowly, the balance began to shift. In parts of the Islamic world, in ancient Rome, in pockets of China and Japan, oil lamps and paper lanterns occasionally turned streets into brief corridors of glow for festivals and processions. In early modern Europe, some cities experimented with hanging lanterns at intersections, ordered householders to put candles in their windows on certain nights. Still, these were patches on a black canvas, exceptions to an overwhelming rule. The real fracture in the long alliance between darkness and danger began with an unlikely substance: gas. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, experimenters in Britain and on the continent were learning how to distill flammable gases from coal and other materials. They discovered that if you captured those vapours, piped them, and burned them in specially designed fixtures, you could get a steady, surprisingly bright flame. Brighter than a candle, brighter than many oil lamps, and crucially, controllable. Instead of having to light and tend each flame one by one, you could open a valve and feed a whole row of burners at once. At first, gaslight was a curiosity. Theatrical impresarios used it to illuminate stages. Factory owners realized they could keep machines running long after sunset. Then city officials noticed something else. Gaslight made streets different. In the early 1800s, London began installing gas lamps along major thoroughfares. Paris followed, eager not to be outdone. Within a few decades, key parts of both cities were laced with lines of iron posts topped by glowing mantles, fed from subterranean pipes. If you'd been a Londoner used to the old nights, the kind where your own front door faded into shadow if you took 3 steps back, this new world would have felt uncanny. Suddenly, main streets no longer vanished after dusk. They stretched ahead in a dotted line of pale halos, each lamp a small island, overlapping into a continuous lane of visibility. The darkness didn't disappear, but it retreated into side alleys and back courtyards. Urban psychology tilted. People began to stroll in the evening, not just hurry home. Shopkeepers kept their windows open longer. Cafes and theatres thrived. A new phrase emerged: nightlife. Gaslight didn't end crime, Thieves and sex workers and pickpockets simply adapted to the lit spaces or worked in the margins where the glow didn't reach. But the stark boundary between safe day and dangerous night blurred a little. Being out after dark no longer automatically marked you as desperate, disreputable, or lost. For many, this felt like progress. The city seemed tamed, brought partially under human control even when the sun was gone. For others, it was disorienting. Moralists grumbled that gaslit boulevards encouraged vice, that people who ought to be asleep were now out gambling, drinking, flirting. Some complained that the artificial light hurt their eyes, spoiled their view of the stars, made nights feel restless and overexposed. But the direction of travel was set. Once people had tasted a brighter night, they didn't go back willingly. And then, just as gaslight was reshaping cities, another revolution stepped quietly onto the stage. It looked, at first, like nothing more than a glowing thread in a glass bubble. In the late 19th century, inventors in Europe and America, including Joseph Swan in Britain and Thomas Edison in the United States, were racing to solve a problem that had defeated tinkerers for decades: how to make something inside a sealed glass bulb glow strongly for a long time without burning up. The technical details were fussy: filament materials, vacuum pumps, electrical resistance. The public didn't care about any of that. What mattered was what happened when you finished wiring a house or a street, flipped a switch, and filled a room with clean, steady light that didn't flicker, smoke, or set the drapes on fire. To people accustomed to gas flames and candles, the first bright electric bulbs must have seemed almost supernatural. No soot, no open flame, no hiss of escaping gas, just an obedient brightness summoned and dismissed by a small mechanical gesture. On, off, night, light. The psychological impact of that control is hard to overstate. For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors had negotiated with darkness. They waited on the movements of the sun and the phases of the moon, hoarded fuel, coaxed and guarded fire. Even with gaslight, someone still had to maintain lines and light mantles. With electricity, especially as grids expanded and systems improved, the negotiation turned into something closer to command. By the early 20th century, electrification was spreading rapidly through the industrialized world. First factories and wealthy homes, then middle-class neighborhoods, then rural areas. Street by street, town by town, the long human habit of surrendering to darkness gave way to something new. You didn't have to go to bed with the sun anymore. You could work a second shift in an illuminated factory. You could read in a bright room at midnight. You could shop, dine, dance, and socialize in spaces that looked, to your eyes, almost like daytime. Culture followed the current. Cities began to define themselves as much by their nocturnal identities as by their daytime industries. Think of the glowing posters and early photographs. New York's Broadway, Paris's boulevards, Berlin's cafes, Tokyo's neon arteries. Electric signs climbed facades. Theatres, cinemas, jazz clubs, cabarets, all flourished under artificial stars. Night changed character. It was no longer simply the time when predators, human or otherwise, had the advantage. It became, at least for those with access to power grids and wages to spend, a time for leisure and pleasure, for entertainment and increasingly for productive labour. The old pattern of first sleep and second sleep, already frayed by urban living and mechanical clocks, began to rupture. People consolidated their sleep into one block to match work schedules and electric-lit evenings. The midnight waking, once a natural contemplative island, shrank or disappeared. From one angle this looked like a clear victory. Humanity had finally, visibly conquered the night. But every conquest leaves something behind. As electric light spread, the faint natural glow that had once been many people's only illumination, starlight, moonlight, the Milky Way, faded from daily experience. In ancient and medieval skies, the stars were dense enough to navigate by, to tell time by, to weave stories into. Constellations were not abstract diagrams, they were familiar presences. The night sky was a ceiling painted in fire. In a modern city, that ceiling is mostly gone. A handful of bright planets, a few stubborn stars, and a dome of reflected light from street lamps and billboards. Astronomers call it sky glow. To most people, it's just normal. The cost of all this brightness isn't just aesthetic. Your body runs on rhythms tuned, over millions of years, to patterns of light and dark. Cells in your eyes, and in other tissues, Read not just brightness but colour, using the difference between blue-rich daylight and the softer spectrum of dusk and firelight to keep your internal clocks aligned. When you flood your nights with bright bluish light from overhead fixtures, screens, LEDs, you send confusing signals to those ancient systems. Melatonin, the hormone that helps initiate sleep, gets suppressed. Circadian rhythms drift. For some, this means a little grogginess, a harder time falling asleep. For others, chronic disruption, insomnia, mood disturbances, metabolic strain. At a planetary scale, the animals that still live by natural night pay a price too. Moths swirl around lamps until exhaustion. Migratory birds, drawn off course by urban glare, collide with buildings. Sea turtles hatch on brightened beaches and crawl inland, mistaking hotel lights for the moon. We wanted to make the dark safe. In many ways, we did. But we also thinned it, frayed it, flooded habitats, including our own nervous systems, with an endless low-level glare that never quite lets anything fully rest. And there's another twist. You might imagine that turning night into day would soothe the ancient fear that once shadows had no place to hide, the old anxiety would wither and die. But that's not what happened. Crime did not vanish under street lamps, it adapted. The threat of fire shifted from candles to overloaded wires. The predators in our stories moved indoors. The intruder behind the lit window, the stranger in the stairwell, the unseen presence on the other end of a glowing screen. Instead of lying awake listening for the pad of paws outside the circle of the campfire, modern humans lie awake watching the rectangle of their phones, scrolling through news, messages and images that keep the amygdala humming. We drove the night back to the edges of our cities and homes, but fear rarely follows simple geography. It migrates. It finds new perches. The irony of our bright age is that we have more control over darkness than any generation before us, and yet sleep disorders, anxiety, and a vague sense of being on alert after sundown are remarkably common. We tamed the outer night. The inner one stayed. To see how those two realms, the lit world and the dark place inside, still interact, we have to look at what exactly we're afraid of now, when we lie in electrically lit rooms, blinds drawn, doors locked, and still feel that old, irrational shiver. Because the predator we evolved to fear did not disappear with the leopards. It learned to live in the light. For your nervous system, the last century and a half might as well have happened yesterday. Evolution works in generations, not product cycles. The brains that fall asleep under LED strips and scrolling notifications tonight are built on blueprints laid down hundreds of thousands of years ago, in a world where after dark meant predators, cliffs, strangers, and the unknown. From that brain's point of view, nothing important has changed. It still assumes that sudden silence might mean something is stalking you. It still treats rustling in the dark as more dangerous than rustling in broad daylight. And it still, very quietly, assigns a higher probability of death to the hours when you can't see. This is what psychologists and biologists sometimes call a mismatch. Your body, your hormones, your reflexes, your innate fears, they were tuned for an environment that no longer exists. A world without streetlights, without locked apartment doors, without emergency services a 3-digit call away. A world where being wrong about a sound in the night could be fatal. In that environment, a hair-trigger fear of the dark was cheap insurance. Imagine 2 children on the savannah. One startles awake at every distant growl, refuses to wander far from the fire, clings to adults after sunset. The other shrugs, sleeps deeply, wanders off to look at the stars. If a predator passes through camp once in a childhood, the relaxed child might die exactly once. The anxious child might lose some sleep but survives to have their own anxious children. Repeat that calculus for thousands of generations. Fear of the dark, even when it was wrong 99 times out of 100, paid off. Now take that same bias and drop it into a 21st century bedroom. Logically, your door is locked. Your building is secure. Your neighborhood is quiet. Predators, in the original tooth and claw sense, are gone. But your amygdala did not retire when electricity arrived. It still runs the old code. You can see the traces of that code in studies of modern adults. When researchers ask people, anonymously, if they're afraid of the dark, a surprising number say yes, not just children. Grown men and women, living in cities, driving cars, doing taxis. Depending on the country and the survey, somewhere between 25% and half of adults admit to at least some fear when the lights go out. Women report it more often, but men are not immune, and those are just the people willing to confess it. Nostophobia, fear of the dark, carries a kind of social embarrassment. It's treated as childish, something you're supposed to outgrow along with stuffed animals and nightlights. That stigma means many people underreport it, or describe it in softer language. I don't like sleeping without a light. I get uneasy in totally dark rooms. I just need the TV on. If you could listen in on hearts and sweat glands, the numbers would probably be higher. You can also see our unchanged wiring in the stories we tell ourselves for fun. Think about how hard filmmakers and game designers work to scare you. Monsters, special effects, elaborate plots, and yet the most reliable piece of their toolkit is still the simplest thing in the world. Turning off the lights. You don't need to see the creature. In fact, it's usually worse when you don't. A character walks down a hallway. One by one, bulbs flicker out. A flashlight beam dies. A door closes with a soft click and everything goes black. Instantly your body reacts, heart rate up, muscles tightening, breath a little shallower. You know rationally that you're in a cinema, or on your couch, or lying in bed listening to a story. But the part of your brain that evolved to keep you alive doesn't make careful distinctions between real and imagined threats. It just sees darkness paired with tension and primes the whole system. Get ready to run, or to fight, or to freeze. Game designers learned the same lesson. Limit the player's vision. Give them just a cone of flashlight or a match that burns down or the weak glow of a lighter. Fill the edges with sounds you can't quite place. Often, nothing is actually there. Your own anticipation does most of the work. Horror novels and ghost stories rely on identical tricks, just translated into language. Descriptions of the corner of the room your eyes can't quite focus on. The staircase that seems too dark compared to the rest of the house. The feeling that someone is standing just beyond the bedroom door. We're still at a very basic level most afraid when we cannot see. That's not an intellectual preference. It's a neural habit born of long selection. Sometimes your brain doesn't even wait for a movie to trigger it. It does the job itself. If you've ever woken up in the middle of the night completely unable to move, feeling a crushing weight on your chest, sensing, with absolute conviction, that something is in the room with you, you've met one of the strangest places where our old fear leaks through, sleep paralysis. In that state, part of your brain is awake enough to be conscious. Another part is still running the paralysis that normally keeps you from acting out your dreams. To make matters more interesting, your threat detection circuits are overactive, and your visual system is starved for input. Put those ingredients together and the result is almost always the same pattern, across cultures and centuries. A presence, not a friendly one. People report shadow people, intruders, demons, witches, aliens, dead relatives. They see figures at the end of the bed, feel hands on their throat, hear footsteps approaching in the dark. From a neuroscientist's point of view, this is your brain trying to explain a body full of fear with no obvious source. The amygdala is firing danger signals, the motor system is locked, the eyes see almost nothing. The simplest narrative is, there is something here, and it wants to hurt me. From the experiencer's point of view, it is utterly convincing. Many who go through intense sleep paralysis are less afraid of the paralysis itself than of that felt presence in the dark. This is the predator that never left. Not a specific animal, but the expectation of one. Even when there is no growl outside the cave, no scrape of claws on rock, the old circuits will happily invent a threat to match the level of arousal they're feeling. Better, from their perspective, to hallucinate danger than to miss the real thing. You can watch the same ancient pattern playing out, less dramatically, in the small rituals of an ordinary night. Think about how people arrange their homes after sunset. Most of us don't plunge our rooms into blackness. We create what anthropologists might call islands of light, little modern campfires. A bedside lamp, a bathroom light cracked open down the hall. The steady glow of a television running in an empty room. The pale rectangle of a phone held inches from a face in an otherwise dark space. Children ask for nightlights, and parents, even ones who don't consider themselves fearful, often leave a corridor lamp on just in case. Adults fall asleep to the hum and flicker of a screen, not because it's comfortable in any deep sense, but because being enveloped in total darkness feels subtly wrong. It's the same strategy your ancestors used around a real fire: keep the immediate area visible, push the unknown back a few meters, and pretend for a while that the rest of the world does not exist. Even when we deliberately seek out natural darkness, the old unease returns. People who grow up in brightly lit cities often have their first encounter with true rural blackness on a camping trip. No street lamps, no neighbouring windows, no sky glow, just forest, or desert, or mountains, and a sky thick with stars. The first reaction is often wonder. The Milky Way, meteors, the sense of scale. Then, once the campfire dies down and conversation fades, something else creeps in. Every twig snap sounds significant. Every gust of wind in the branches could be footsteps. The tent wall, which felt sturdy at setup, now seems like tissue paper. You become aware of the thinness of fabric against whatever is, or might be, just beyond it. Rationally, you know there are probably no large predators. You might even have read the park brochures that tell you so. But your breathing still quickens. You still check the zipper twice. You still feel that old, irrational conviction. Something is out there. These reactions aren't failures of modernity or proofs of personal cowardice. They're the echo of very old realities. For almost all of human history, fear of the dark was not a phobia. It was a sense organ, a way of perceiving risk in an environment you couldn't fully control. In well-lit bedrooms and glowing cities, that organ sits mostly idle, but it does not atrophy. It waits. It tingles a little when the power goes out, when a hallway is unexpectedly unlit, when you wake at 3 in the morning and find the room unfamiliar. The external predators changed. The world of night transformed under gaslight and electricity. But the part of you that whispers, "Careful, you can't see what's there," is the same part that helped your ancestors survive leopards, hyenas, rival humans, and deep moonless wilderness. You carry it with you into every lit room, every glowing screen, every carefully secured modern home. Learning to live with that ancient voice, to hear what it's telling you without letting it run your life, is part of being human. And sometimes, if you listen closely, it has something to teach you. So where does that leave you? Lying in a safe bed, in a mostly safe world, with a heart that still jumps at shadows. It's tempting to treat that fear as a bug in the system, something childish, irrational, anxious, something you're supposed to fix. But if you zoom out to the timescale we've been travelling through tonight, it looks very different. It looks like a badge. The only reason you're here to feel afraid of the dark is that, generation after generation, your ancestors were afraid of it first. The ones who weren't afraid enough weren't careful enough, who didn't feel that quiet rising tension after sunset. Most of them didn't make it into the deep future. They were the ones who shrugged and walked away from the fire alone, who didn't bother to check the tree line, who heard a sound behind them and decided it was probably nothing. Every time a leopard dragged a careless hominin into the bush, every time a child wandered too close to a cliff edge in moonless night, every time a stranger with bad intentions slipped into a camp, natural selection took a tiny, invisible note. This lineage? A little less likely to go on. The other lineage, the jumpier one, the one that slept lightly, the one that clustered close to others when the sun went down, kept going. You are the product of that filter. Every neuron in your amygdala, every tiny surge of adrenaline when the lights go off, is testimony that they listened to their fear and survived. So when you feel that familiar unease, you're not malfunctioning, you're remembering. Not with words or images, but with physiology, with heart rate, with pupil dilation, with the sense that no, you would actually prefer the door to stay closed and the curtain not to move. For most of our history, that wasn't neurosis, it was wisdom. Today, a strange thing is happening. As electric light conquers more and more of the planet, people are starting to realize that something else is being lost with the darkness we once feared. Cities cast domes of sky glow that wash out the stars for miles. For many children born in major urban areas, the Milky Way isn't a familiar sight. It's something from photographs, from apps, from planetarium shows. In response, there's a small, quiet movement to protect what used to be automatic, natural night. They're called dark sky reserves and dark sky parks, stretches of land where outdoor lighting is limited, shielded, directed downward. Places where, on a clear night, the sky looks closer to what your ancestors saw. People go to these places expecting astronomy, expecting to tick off constellations, comet tails, perhaps a planet or two. What they report over and over is something else. First, a kind of shock, the sheer number of stars, the density of them, the pale river of the Milky Way cutting from horizon to horizon. Space not as a few bright points above a city, but as a vast textured backdrop you can almost fall into. Then a feeling that is harder to name. Some call it awe, some call it vertigo, some say it feels like standing on the shore of an ocean in the dark, hearing waves you can't see. You become very aware of your own smallness, of the thinness of the atmosphere, of the fact that you're on the surface of a rock in space. And underneath that wonder, if you stay long enough, the old animal alertness stirs. You notice how black the land is compared to the sky, how your eyes can't penetrate more than a few meters beyond the edge of a campsite, how, between the scattered pools of red-filtered light and the silhouettes of trees or rocks, there are deep wells of pure unknown. Voices drop without quite knowing why. People stay closer together. Laughter comes out softer, edged with that same awareness. The dark is back, the real dark. For a moment, modern time thins. The centuries of gas lamps and neon and LEDs peel away, and you are once again what you have been for most of your history, a small primate under a vast sky, watching and listening. If you lean into that feeling instead of pulling away, there's a kind of philosophical clarity waiting there. Darkness in this sense is not just an absence of light, it's a presence, a reminder. It reminds you that you are an animal wired by evolution, not a disembodied intellect that happens to have a body attached. It reminds you that your mind, with all its language and memory and plans, is built on older foundations, instincts honed on plains and in forests, through ice ages and droughts and long dangerous nights. It reminds you that you are very recent, that the entire history of cities and electric grids and glowing screens fits into a sliver of the timeline we traced earlier. That for far longer than you have been reading and typing and commuting, your ancestors were squinting into the dark, hearing things move just out of sight. And it reminds you of scale. Above you, light that left its sources before humans existed. Around you, genes that survived bottlenecks, plagues, volcanic winters, and predators whose eyes shone back from the edge of the firelight. Inside you, neural circuits that still, faithfully track the boundary between safety and danger, day and night. Understanding this doesn't magically erase fear, but it can change its meaning. Instead of thinking, why am I like this? Why can't I just relax? You can translate the feeling into its ancient message. The tightness in your chest, the prickle on your skin, the quick flick of your eyes toward the doorway. That's your lineage saying, darkness has always been when we were most vulnerable. Pay attention. In a city apartment, that signal is usually miscalibrated. The predators you evolved to fear are not there, but the circuitry is still honest. It is doing exactly what it was constructed to do, under conditions it never anticipated. There is comfort in that honesty. You are not uniquely weak or broken or childish for feeling uneasy when the lights go out. You are thoroughly, properly human. You can even make a kind of peace with that voice. You can acknowledge it. Yes, I hear you. Yes, it's dark. And then answer with information your ancestors didn't have. The door is locked, the windows are secure, the nearest large carnivore is in a documentary not outside the house. Some people find that when they frame their fear this way, it loosens. It becomes less like an accusation and more like a conversation between eras of the self. Ancient brain. It's dark. Be careful. Modern brain. Thank you, but we're okay tonight. And sometimes, if you're somewhere truly quiet, somewhere where the stars are visible and the nearest road is miles away, you can let the old vigilance rise a little higher, not to torment you, but to remind you of connection. Connection to every ancestor who ever stared into a black tree line, to every small group that curled together near a dwindling fire, to every child who listened for growls on the wind, and every adult who stayed awake a little longer to keep watch. That lineage is unbroken, all the way to you. So when you turn off the lights after this story and the room settles around you, there may be a moment, a flicker, when the dark feels a little too thick. Maybe you'll check the hallway, maybe you'll listen for a second longer than usual, maybe you'll feel that twinge at the back of your neck that says something could be there. If that happens, you don't have to fight it. You can recognize it for what it is, an echo. The softest whisper of 1,000,000 nights survived. A message passed down through bodies instead of words. Stay alert. Stay alive. Tonight, you don't need that warning in the old way, but you can honor it. Let it remind you that you are part of a story that began long before electricity, long before houses, long before names, a story written in darkness and firelight, in fear and in survival. Then, with that in mind, you can close your eyes. Let the ancient dark do what it has always done when the watching is over. Hold you, for a while, until the sun comes back. So as you lie there now, with walls around you instead of branches, with a mattress instead of packed earth, you are carrying all of that with you. The leopards at the cave mouth, the rustle of hyenas in the grass, the long patient eyes of things that hunted by starlight. You carry the first circles of fire, that trembling orange line that pushed the dark back a few meters and turned predators into silhouettes. You carry the first stories told in that flickering zone where claws and teeth slowly transformed into spirits, monsters, and gods. You carry the slow brightening of the world, oil lamps, candles, gaslight, filament bulbs, neon LEDs, each one another step away from the nights that shaped you, and yet never quite far enough to erase them. Every porch light, every street lamp, every small blue glow of a nightlight humming in a hallway. They're all part of the same negotiation your ancestors began when they first dared to sleep with their backs to the dark. Tonight, you joined that negotiation in a different way. You walk the path backward in your mind, from your own quiet room to savannas and caves and volcanic winters, to population bottlenecks and branching species, to predators whose names you'll never know, but whose pressure you still feel. Knowing that the next time you click off a lamp and feel that tiny spike of unease, you don't have to see it as a flaw. You can treat it as a greeting, an old instinct saying, "We remember," you answering, "I understand." If this journey through deep time and deep night has kept you company, you can help it reach other people who might need the same calm distraction. You can like this video, subscribe for more history told at a sleepy pace, and if you'd like, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from, which patch of the planet this long shared story is curled up in tonight, and if your curiosity is still awake, even as your body gets heavy, there's more waiting for you beyond this episode. At sleepytimehistory.com, there's a book full of prehistoric secrets and quiet tales from the deep past, a slow companion for evenings when you want to drift off with mammoths, denisovans, and starlit campfires in the background of your thoughts. For now, though, you've done enough. You've followed your fear of the dark all the way back to its source, watched it take shape in the grass and in the caves, and seen how it protected the fragile line that led to you. So let the room dim around you. Let your breathing match the slow rhythm of those ancient fires as they burned down to coals. Outside, the darkness is still there, just as it has always been. But tonight, you know it better. And knowing perhaps makes it a little less frightening, and a little more like an old, familiar presence keeping watch while you sleep. Rest well, descendant of survivors. Good night from the deep past.